Can the U.S. impose a full blockade on North Korea? 2. North Korea Denuclearization Scenario. Creating the miracle on the Taedong River. North Korean Workers' Party can give up nuclear weapons. To start with the conclusion, it is realistically very difficult for the United States to pressure North Korea through a complete blockade, and it is nearly impossible to get China and Russia to join or prevent them from opposing it. Let us first examine the feasibility of a complete blockade. There are military and legal issues involved. A naval blockade or quarantine could be considered an act of war. If the United States were to implement this unilaterally without a UN Security Council resolution, it would spark significant controversy under international law and would require inspecting and blocking not only North Korean vessels, but also ships related to China and Russia. This would create a risk of direct conflict. There is also the issue of limited effectiveness. North Korea is already holding out by evading sanctions through ship-to-ship transfers, land routes across the Chinese border, and cryptocurrency hacking, and these efforts have been further strengthened by support from Russia and China. Even with a complete blockade, it is difficult to stop North Korea's underground economy and cyber revenue streams. Under the current circumstances, there are practically no ways to involve China and Russia or neutralize them. China is North Korea's largest trading partner and prioritizes stability above all else. Fearing an influx of refugees and the proximity of U.S. forces following the collapse of the North Korean regime, it opposes strong pressure. While it cooperated with some sanctions in the past 2017, it now takes the position of effectively condoning or actively supporting sanctions evasion. Even if the U.S. strengthens secondary sanctions against Chinese companies and banks, China responds through its domestic financial system and non-dollar transactions. Russia has deepened military cooperation with North Korea, including the exchange of weapons and troops, due to the war in Ukraine. It is also involved in the dissolution of the UN sanctions panel, Russia's veto in 2024, and utilizes North Korea as a strategic asset. If the U.S. exerts pressure, it is highly likely that Russia will support North Korea even more actively. Let us look at the leverage aspect of enforcement. While the U.S. can impose secondary sanctions on Chinese and Russian companies using its economic power, dollar hegemony, SWIFT, etc., this would only further strengthen the CRINC China-Russia-Iran-North alliance. These countries have already established sanctions evasion networks to respond jointly to U.S. pressure. Even if the U.S. attempts to trade off China over issues such as Taiwan or energy and trade negotiations, it is difficult to concede on the North Korean issue, as it is a core interest, a buffer zone. Although maximum pressure could be attempted in a second Trump term, its effectiveness would be limited due to active resistance from China and Russia, as seen in past experiences. So, does the U.S. no longer have the power to do so? It is a cold and accurate reality to view the situation as one where the overwhelming power of a unipolar world, which once moved the entire globe according to the U.S. will, no longer exists. While some power still remains, the cost is too high. Although the U.S. possesses the world's strongest navy and economy, it must bear the risks of large-scale conflict with China, especially at sea, disruptions to global supply chains, and skyrocketing energy prices. Given the current geopolitical environment involving Russia-Ukraine tensions, Middle East tensions, and the rise of China, the U.S. seeks to avoid a multi-front strategy. A complete containment is a high-cost option that does not align with America first. Even during the maximum pressure campaign of 2017-2018, the U.S. failed to completely control China and Russia. Now, with CRINC cooperation becoming more robust, the relative influence of the U.S. has weakened. To trust each other. Let us look specifically at the reasons why the United States cannot coerce China and Russia. The most powerful non-military weapon the United States uses to influence other countries is secondary boycotts. This involves threatening to expel Chinese and Russian banks and companies that trade with North Korea from the U.S. financial system dollar settlement network. In the past, fearing this blade, China cautiously participated in UN sanctions against North Korea, but the situation has completely changed now. Russia is in a state where it has nothing to lose. Russia is already subject to the highest level of comprehensive sanctions in history from the United States following the war in Ukraine. Since there are no more devastating financial sanctions left for the U.S. to impose, Russia is openly trading missiles, food, and labor with North Korea, mocking U.S. pressure. China is building an alternative financial network and has massively expanded the CIP's Chinese independent procurement system to counter U.S. dollar hegemony. The U.S. financial blockade is ineffective because a workaround has been established to support North Korea through the yuan, ruble, or even digital currency or barter trade, bypassing the U.S. dollar. China is also actively engaging in legal countermeasures. Recently, the Chinese government has been clashing head-on with the U.S. by refusing to recognize unilateral secondary boycotts and even enacting a legal blocking order to punish foreign companies within China that cooperate with U.S. sanctions. North Korea, as a geopolitical buffer zone, is a core strategic interest for China, and Russia also needs North Korea as a shield. To China and Russia, North Korea is not merely an ally, but a massive breakwater that prevents U.S. influence from encroaching upon their national borders. The core logic of China and Russia is as follows. If North Korea is completely blockaded and the Kim Jong-un regime collapses, the Korean peninsula will be unified under the leadership of South Korea, which is allied with the U.S. If that happens, U.S. forces Korea and advanced U.S. radar bases will be deployed right in front of the Yalu and Tumen River borders. Why would we help the U.S. and let North Korea go to ruin? For this reason, while North Korea's nuclear provocations are a headache for China, it absolutely cannot tolerate the collapse of the North Korean regime. This is precisely why China continues to provide crude oil and food behind the scenes, keeping North Korea on oxygen mask, despite all the pressure from the United States. The North Korean nuclear card also serves as a means for China to maintain its negotiating power in U.S.-China talks. Furthermore, without North Korea, China's regional dominance in Northeast Asia would weaken. As a supplier of energy and food that accounts for over 90% of trade between North Korea and China, China also holds significant economic interests. From China's perspective, North Korea is a manageable nuisance, not a target for elimination. While nuclear advancement is a burden, the collapse of North Korea would be an even greater catastrophe. Russia's recent changes in relations with North Korea represent a structural shift since 2022. Following the war in Ukraine, Russia-North Korea relations have been elevated from transactional cooperation to a strategic partnership. North Korea has supplied Russia with millions of artillery shells and ballistic missiles, and in return, Russia provides energy, food, and military technology. Currently, there is zero incentive for Russia to participate in pressure campaigns against North Korea. Let us examine the means by which the United States can prevent China and Russia from opposing a full-scale blockade of North Korea. Secondary sanctions against China are the most powerful card. By blocking Chinese companies and banks that do business with North Korea from the U.S. financial system and excluding them from the dollar settlement network SWIFT, access to the U.S. market is prohibited. During the 2005 sanctions against BDA Banco Delta Asia, freezing just $25 million in North Korean accounts paralyzed the North Korean financial system and forced their return to the six-party talks. During the second round of sanctions on Iran, China's Kunlun Bank, Costco, and others were actually cut off from the dollar network, causing Iran's crude oil exports to decrease by 70%. But why isn't it being done now? If linked to the U.S.-China trade war, the risk of an all-out economic war increases. China is using cards such as selling U.S. Treasury bonds and restricting rare earth exports as retaliation. And Wall Street and U.S. companies are lobbying the U.S. government, claiming they are losing the Chinese market. Trump shows a tendency to try to deal tariff negotiations and North Korea separately. However, Trump's second term is actually strengthening secondary sanctions against Iran. If there is the will, secondary sanctions against China are a real tool that the U.S. currently possesses. Is it possible to change the very structure of China's interests regarding North Korea? The core reason China cannot abandon North Korea is the fear that, if North Korea collapses, U.S. troops will come to the Yalu River. If this fear is eliminated, the calculations change. A package of specific proposals, these are the options the United States could present. One possibility involves legally guaranteeing the withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea or prohibiting their deployment north of the 38th parallel upon the reorganization of the Korean peninsula following denuclearization. Another option is to consider granting priority development rights for Chinese special economic zones in North Korea or forging an international treaty guaranteeing the neutralization of both North and South Korea. While this package entails the U.S. paying enormous political costs to South Korea and Japan, it aligns with Trump's deal logic. In fact, this is a direction that strategists aligned with the Kissinger school have long advocated. A strategy to separate Russia by linking it to negotiations in Ukraine. The close ties between Russia and North Korea are a byproduct of the war in Ukraine. Once the war ends, Russia's need for North Korea will drastically decrease. One can envision a process following ceasefire negotiations in Ukraine that includes easing sanctions on Russia, offering participation in economic reconstruction, reversing the cost-benefit of cooperation with North Korea, and halting Russia's supply of materials to the north. Trump's haste in the Ukraine negotiations may be partly driven by this potential for linkage. However, since Russia has already received concessions in exchange for the transfer of North Korean nuclear technology, the practical benefits of suspending cooperation have diminished. The reason the United States' power is not what it used to be is due to structural changes. To be frank, dollar hegemony has weakened relatively. The SWIFT bypass network CIPS, the yuan payment network is expanding, and the establishment of dollar-free trade systems among China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea is underway. However, since the dollar remains the dominant reserve currency, the power of secondary sanctions remains effective. The relative reduction of military superiority is also a factor. China's naval power in the Western Pacific is growing to a level that rivals the United States, and Russia's nuclear capabilities are on par with the U.S. However, the United States remains dominant in conventional forces and alliance networks. The core issue is a matter of will versus capability. It is not that the United States lacks the capability to implement a complete blockade of North Korea, but rather that it lacks the will to pay the cost. Applying secondary sanctions to China on a full scale would lead to a full-scale U.S.-China economic war, skyrocketing consumer prices, and losses for Wall Street. U.S. domestic politics is not prepared to bear these costs. Trump, in particular, appears unwilling to pay these costs for the denuclearization of North Korea. The limitations of the U.S. dual containment strategy also play a role. Currently, the United States faces a so-called multi-front, where it must simultaneously engage in a war with China over the Taiwan Strait and technology, a war with Russia over Ukraine, and the provision of a nuclear umbrella over the Korean peninsula in response to North Korea. Here are realistic alternatives and prospects. The United States is highly likely to pursue selective reinforcement sanctions on specific vessels and companies, utilizing the multilateral sanctions monitoring team in parallel with diplomatic and military deterrence. Instead of a complete blockade, it will likely attempt to manage the situation through smart pressure. Under the Trump style, He might attempt to use the North Korea card in major deals with China trade and Taiwan, but the chances of success are low. Consequently, attempts to isolate North Korea carry a high risk of escalating confrontation with China and Russia, thereby raising tensions on the Korean peninsula. While South Korea may welcome increased pressure from the U.S., it must endure the economic and security side effects resulting from the backlash from China and Russia. In summary, while theoretically possible, it is practically a high-risk, low-effective option. The U.S. is now shifting its strategy toward management and deterrence rather than total containment. This is due to the structurally difficult geopolitical reality of forcibly drawing in China and Russia. It is not that the U.S. has lost its capability, rather, it is choosing not to pursue total containment based on cost-benefit calculations. A second round of dollar sanctions remains a nuclear bomb-level economic tool, and a package deal that structurally resolves China's security concerns is theoretically feasible. However, implementing this would require accepting the risk of an all-out U.S.-China economic clash, sacrificing significant portions of security commitments to South Korea and Japan, and bearing domestic political costs, inflation, corporate losses. The Trump administration prefers short-term gains through a deal over these costs. Ultimately, the North Korean issue boils down to a matter of strategic priorities and political will, rather than the limits of U.S. capability. Next time, I will discuss a scenario in which the U.S. moves toward allowing South Korea and Japan to arm themselves with nuclear weapons, thereby causing China and Russia to deter North Korea on their own initiative. Thank you.